everyone. Back to the forum, Become a Delegate with this very special international conference we are hosting right now with three fellows I'd like to introduce you to. I am very pleased to host Othman Almoamar from Saudi Arabia, as well as Jordan Abdi from the UK and Alberta Pellino from Italy. Friends, you are here to speak to all candidates that France has brought together to apply to the next generation of Y20 and Y7 delegates. As I told you, we received this year more than 590 applications, and actually almost half of them dropped already in the course of our very selective forum. Half of them are still present to listen to you and to ask questions about this very unique experience. And I remind our friends and candidates that they are invited to ask that question via the chat, via the question and answer system of Zoom, so that they can directly address to you. I will present you in this order. Othman, you are from Saudi Arabia, as I told the group. You studied at the Penn University in the US, Penn State University, and after at Duke University, one of the most leading business schools across the world. And that brought you actually to the current position you hold as the research lead at the MISC Foundation in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And obviously the most impressive achievement that you did already, from what I know of your life, and that's only me. You chaired the Y20 Summit in 2020 with amazing results and amazing time, because that was the COVID-19 crisis first year, and that was also the 10-year anniversary of the Y20. So Othman, I'm very pleased to host you. Welcome.
Thank you so much. And hello.
We also have Jordan from the UK. Jordan is a medical doctor from background. He studied medicine and neuroscience back in the years. He's now in a professional capacity that is very different as the strategy and business development lead at Holmusk. He's been volunteering for years now. He is currently the chief operating officer at our sister organization in the UK called Future Leaders Network, which is on the way to prepare the Y7 Summit, the upcoming Y7 Summit, which you co-chair, Jordan, with your fellow Sophie, if I'm not mistaken. You've been also a global shaper at the World Economic Forum. You were a delegate to the Y20 Summit in China 2016. You also have been delegate to the Y7 Summit in Italy in 2017, which is the moment when I turn to Alberta. Welcome, Jordan. And Alberta, you also, I'm turning back to you then from that moment, because you chaired the Y7 Summit I just referred to in Italy in 2017. You are about to chair the Y20 Summit this year in Milan in July, because you actually have founded and presided over, for the last 10 years, Young Ambassadors Society, which is the sister organization of Open Diplomacy in Italy. We were so proud in finding you as the leader of that amazing organization 10 years ago when we crafted the first Y20 and Y8 Summit in Paris. See, at that time, you were ambassador to the Girls 20, which was one of the emerging groups surrounding the G20. In the meanwhile, you graduated from Bocconi University. You have been working extensively in finance. You're currently working at the trading desk of Mercuria Energy Group. And you also have been, just like Jordan, a global shaper of the World Economic Forum. Thank you, all of you, for being with us today. It's the first time that during our forum we host former chairs or next chairs of Y20 and Y7 summits. It's a great honor to host you. I have a first question that I'll ask first to Othman and then to Jordan. which is quite simple. It's about the story that is behind those extensive and amazing biographies. How did you get to be the Y20, Y7 chair, co-chair? How did you make it to that position, which is like amazing to the people we are hosting today? What did you learn from that role? Othman first.
Thank you so much for the amazing introductions, Thomas. And thank you all for attending. Thanks to Alberta and Jordan for leading the Y7 and the Y20 in 2021. It's a huge task, but I'm sure you guys are going to do fantastic. So how did I get to be the chair of Y20? Essentially, I started after I finished my master's degree, it was in business and management. And at the time, I thought that maybe business isn't necessarily, or maybe a job in banking isn't necessarily the right thing for me. So I did the usual Uthman thing, and I went to something completely different than what I started learning in. I went to a startup think tank focusing on public policy in Saudi Arabia. And at the time, public policy was not such a big thing. And I focused on local government affairs, looking into youth issues, and so on and so forth. Afterwards, I went through consulting, focusing on education. And of course, you can't talk about education without talking about young people. And then afterwards, I ended up at MISC Foundation. And during my time at MISC, I led research projects, mostly focusing on youth affairs. I led something called the Global Youth Index, which looks into basically comparing how countries prepare their young people for the 21st challenges or 21st century challenges. And essentially the comparisons here were between 25 countries. All G20 countries were included, including Saudi Arabia. And what we found out essentially is that young people were woefully unprepared for the challenges that are coming up. Keeping in mind, of course, that this was in 2018, before COVID. So you could see the bigger challenges now. After working on the GYI, or the Global Youth Index, for a couple of years, I also led a couple of white papers on youth affairs, mostly focusing on leadership, entrepreneurship, education, and skills. And then the G20 transferred over from Japan to Saudi, and I attended Y20 in Tokyo. And there was a lot of discussions internally within the G20 in Saudi. And then I was recommended through MISC to chair the Y20, and hence I became chair.
Well, that is a journey indeed, from being in business to more public policy work, and that we will keep digging in this experience. We have so many questions raising from the chat to learn from what you did as the chair. But I'd like to ask Jordan, who is about to chair. I mean, you already do the job, but I mean, the high moment is the summit itself. So you must already have some insights on the turn to that position. What do you expect from it? How do you want to make it a success for the Y7 summit in 2021?
Absolutely, and thank you very much, Thomas, for your very kind introduction. And can I also say it's a real honor to share the stage today with Alberta and Othman. I've known them for some years now, and they are truly phenomenal people. I guess I'll answer your first question first, Thomas, a little about how I became co-chair, and then what sort of we have in the pipeline and the ambition that we want to deliver this year for the Y7. To kind of a little long story short, I was as Thomas, you mentioned, delegate to the 2016 Y20 summit in China. Incredible experience, phenomenal summit, really exciting delegates. And can I say the lead up and the summit itself were phenomenal, but I distinctly recall coming back to the UK and feeling extremely frustrated with any kind of lack of momentum to do anything beyond the summit. It almost disappeared. And I actually shared this frustration with the head delegate of the then Y7 delegation in Japan, who is Sophie Dowd, who is the other co-chair of this summit. And we said, look, this is really a lack of momentum. There's a problem in the whole pipeline. No one in the UK knows about these summits. And this is a massive opportunity to not only include them in the entire process, but to use this as a platform to bounce off and lead to sort of more advocacy and change in the real world. So we spent the last 2016, the last sort of 3 or 4 years, really revamping the summit experience for UK delegates. And that is in the pre-summit period, so consultations with UK youth, in dramatically scaling up the access we have to have access to, and also the input we get from both government, third sector, private sector, and so on. And that sort of built us up to 2020. In 2020, we were, firmly a well-oiled machine at the Future Leaders Network. We have the Y7, Y20 opportunities and a few other pieces domestically. But nonetheless, when it came to the Y7 2021, we still had to bid to government to be the organizers for this summit, despite us being really the only organization that has any touch or feel to this. So we had to put together a pretty ambitious plan about why we were the right people to chair the summit, and two, what we were going to be able to deliver. And maybe I'll speak a little bit about our ambition. So we see this year being the 10-year anniversary of this whole process as a massive opportunity to leverage all of that momentum into a transition point for young people to be far more included and involved at the highest levels. I mean, we'll speak a little later, I suspect, about COVID-19, but this is a pivotal year for young people if we are to recover effectively from this crisis. And what we are ambition, and delegates who will be joining us and those who will be following the process will see, we have lined up a rich network of thought leaders to be participatory in the process to support delegates, but also wider sector network, youth, young people who are not necessarily included typically in these process will have access to speak to delegates, to hear presentations for delegates, and have that loop closed. And then following the summit, we have quite ambitious post-summit initiatives. We won't necessarily be able to determine or fixate those across all of the member states, but certainly for the UK delegations, we have a pretty robust plan in place where we leverage the network we've built and connected all the delegates to the various Sherpas to hold them somewhat accountable to the promises they made as part of the the G7 process, but also to empower young people to actually be able to do some of this change making themselves. I will speak maybe a little bit more of that later on, but I think at a high level, that is what we're hoping to achieve.
Thank you so much, Jordan and Othman, for letting us know about this amazing experience that lasted for the last 12 months for Othman, and that is in the verge of becoming a strong and very occupying reality for Jordan. But I'd like to turn to Alberta, who has been involved in the process for a decade as well. Alberta, you've already chaired the Y7 Summit. You're about to chair the Y20 Summit. You've been a delegate for a few times, and you've been recruiting the Italian delegates for a decade now. How did you get to that position? What was the start, the spin of it? And what is the main lesson that you've been taking away for this from this decade of experience that is 10 times much bigger than what we already listened from Othman and Jordan?
Thank you very much, Thomas. Thank you very much for inviting me. Yeah, it's been 10 years. It's a lot of time, isn't it? I basically started when I was 19, so at the very beginning of university. And as you said before, I was initially selected to be a Girls 20 delegate. So I went to Toronto for this other summit for young people, especially women. After that, you may remember that I basically was selected to be a delegate in France. So for the Y20, it was at that time, I think, Y20. And at that moment, actually, we met at that summit. So it's been a long time. And at that point, I think that I had a similar story to what Jordan said. I actually realized that in Italy, there was not a structure, there was not an organization that was actually dealing with selecting and training the delegates for the summit. So also with the help, and I'm very thankful for that, of open diplomacy, of course you remember that, I guess. I started the association in Italy, the Young Ambassador Society, so we did all the legal paperwork. We started to recruiting people for the association and just to start working on projects, really. Of course, at the beginning it was hard, also because I think that things change a lot in 10 years. The attention that governments and institutions are giving to young people now, I think that it's way bigger than the attention that was given 10 years ago. So of course, it was even harder to make our voice listened. And I think that open diplomacy did a great job also organizing the Y7, Y20 at that time. After that, I mean, we basically saw the Young Ambassador Society growing year by year. And two key lessons were the first one, having a team, because of course, as also Jordan and you and Othman could say, organizing a summit, recruiting the delegates, it's a huge job. As also I'm basically volunteering for the association. So as you said, I work in finance full time, but I spend a lot of time in the Young Ambassador Society. So having a team as passionate as you and ready to commit to the project, I think that it's like absolutely key. And the other lesson was the importance of building a close relationship with the institution, especially linked to the goal of Young Ambassador Society and all the other associations that are in the G7, G20 youth networks. And this is like, I think, a relation that you really build year by year. In 10 years, of course, the people in charge in the Italian government and ministries change it because, I mean, as you may know, we change a lot of government. And so every time, basically, you need to keep contact with the new people. But at the same time, I must say that now it has become pretty easy because it's been 10 years. There is kind of very, very good relationship with all the institutions. So even if there are new people at the institution, they already know the Young Ambassador Society name. They already know our name. So now it's pretty straightforward. And that's how I became the chair of this year. We didn't need to present any special plan. I mean, just the government knows that he is in charge for this process. And it was pretty straightforward to recognize the association as the main chair of the summit. But I mean, I must say this is a result of a 10-year job. So it's not just like we started yesterday. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Alberta. That is a long story put short, and it gives me the opportunity to highlight to those applicants who discover this entire story that it is not like an evidence, like something absolutely natural for the G20 or the G7 to have engagement groups. It has been a fight, a long fight, and not only a fight to get to create the Y20 and Y7, but to create national, legally established organizations that are able and trusted to make this happen every year. Open diplomacy was in France created therefore in 2010, and we've been bringing together already established organization, also getting along with the creation of sister organization, just like Young Ambassadors Society or Future Leaders Network in the UK and in Italy. Mix Foundation is a gift from destiny that happened to be part of our network to crystallize the Y20 initiative in Saudi Arabia. But this is a journey that has been very demanding to make sure we have trusted partners all across the globe to make this happen. And as you pointed out, Alberta, and that's going to be the transition to the next question, it is a yearly challenge to connect to the government. Jordan told that he had to bid for the next Y7 summit, even though Future Leaders Network have been on the line for a few years, or even since the beginning. It's every year a challenge that youth is heard. And Othman, that gives me a good start to ask you the next question. It's not only a very demanding challenge to make it happen on the logistics, but it's also a demanding challenge to pass recommendations to make sure that the G20 endorses ideas that youth is advocating for. And I know you've been very committed to that goal this year. Could you let us know how it materialized in 2020?
Sure. So when you're thinking about advocacy or making policy change, the first thing that you have to do is first identify who the stakeholders are. And in the G20 sense, that's not always easy, right? First of all, because it changes from one year to the next. And every single year, there's a new country that hosts it, when there's new chairs for working groups, and there's new chairs for engagement groups. And then there is multiple ways of collaboration, and you have to keep the cultures in mind. So in Saudi, we've done a stakeholder map of who are the most important stakeholders that we wanted to reach out to. And of course, the G20 being the top stakeholder that we wanted to impact in terms of policy. But even within the G20, there are different working groups that operate separately, sometimes from each other, and they each kind of share their own policies at the end of their meetings. And usually that means that by the time that August comes around or September, they have their policies kind of submitted and ready to go through a ministerial meeting. There is approximately, I think, 10 or 11 working groups by the G20. Each of them focus on a specific priority area. So for example, there's the education working group, there is the employment working group, there is the development working group, and so on. So we looked internally into the priority areas that Y20 focused on for 2020. And then we looked at the G20 side and we highlighted specific working groups that are the priority of who we wanted to advocate for and we actually wanted to impact the policies for. We identified three main ones, of course, employment and education being the main ones, and energy being the third one. And we also wanted to include development because they focus on the SDGs as a key stakeholders that we wanted to impact. And then since we identified them, we then went to the process of actually finding out which were the main ways to help us get to that. And advocacy isn't always easy. It means that you go and you have to contact people directly. You have to bring chairs of the working groups and have meetings with them. You have to explain what your priorities are. You have to align your priorities to their priorities and so on and so forth. And sometimes you have to do that alongside other engagement groups. So we went and also did the same thing for our fellow engagement groups. You have the W20, you have the S20, you have the C20, you have so many others. We identified the ones that had the most alignment with our priority areas. We developed joint statements with them and we advocated to them. And we specifically focused on about 2 to 3 policies per working group in order for us to not be too distracted. And luckily enough, that had paid off quite a bit because when we looked at the employment working group, there was one commitment by the G20 that was made in 2015 in Turkey that was focused on ensuring that there were few people or fewer than 15% younger than 30 who are part of the unemployment. And so we focused on that goal and we pushed the employment working group to actually commit to it because it's been 2020, now 5 years, there has been no commitment on the G20 front. And so we wanted to make sure that this is solidly made and make sure that this policy is actually implemented into the leaders' communique. And so we went to all of the meetings that we were invited to. Even for meetings that we didn't invite to, we published policy statements directly to the working group and to the Sherpas as well. And lo and behold, by the time that November 20 came around, the leaders' communique was published and there were at least 5 references to youth. One of the main ones was the youth roadmap to 2025. And that's when we knew we hit it quite big.
Well, thank you very much, Othman. That is 100% clear on the road ahead, the Y20 and the Y7. That relates to a question that was raised in the chat by Hugo. Hugo is looking forward to know what happens after the Y20, Y7 summit. And that's why I like to turn again to Jordan. You explained in your introduction that you've been very frustrated after being a delegate to the 2016 summit, and that gave you the demanding energy to now do the job you're volunteering for. That relates to my first question. How do you make it through? How do you make sure that the Y7 connects to the G7? Tell us about your advocacy plans for the year to come.
No, absolutely. And if I may answer that question really on twofold. I think after the summit, you have 2 obligations to delegates. The first obligation, I think, is to ensure that the priorities of the young people that has been demonstrated through the communique does reach the G7. And I'll speak a little bit about that in a second. I think the second obligation is to feed back to young people who were involved in the process of consultation, of engaging with their respective national delegates, of what happened, what were the priorities that you took to the summit, what were the issues that you presented, and what were the solutions that you came with? How did you negotiate with your counterparties to actually do something there? And from our perspective, and certainly what we've been building up to in the last few years, and we're going to hope to project this year, is to make it very easy for organising committees to feed directly back to their respective young people, make it very easy and clear to see how engaging in this process leads to real change. And I think that's an important component. I think specifically to your point around how do we ensure that we connect and link Y7 and the G7, The first thing I'll say, I think the Y7 is at the greatest disadvantage when it comes to the respective working groups, because unlike almost every other working group, we are on annual rotation. If you look at the business 7, if you look at the civil 7, what you'll see is that these lobbying groups have sort of long-standing relationships with the Sherpa, long-standing shared commitments, that when they re-engage year on year, they're tweaking policies, they're reacting to national changes in the preceding year, and they have a sort of a slicker operation to enter into the G7 process. The Y7 almost resets every year and almost has to fight that same battle of being heard from scratch. Fresh faces, new people. And so we decided we want to tackle this problem sort of head on. Over the last sort of 3 years, we have been slowly cultivating our relationship with government, with Cabinet Office, and we really started the process of preparing for the G7 last summer. And what that really looked like was meeting, first of all of the respective Sherpa for the UK G7 that prepared, to understand what are their strategic priorities for the year ahead. And even if they didn't necessarily have firm policy areas, that they only already come up with those in the last month or so, we wanted to get a sense of what are their ways of working, what are their key areas, and what they like to hear from us. The second piece is engaging with the other working groups. So we have made strong connections with all the respective business level, civil 7, think tank 7, and so on, to ensure that when the youth summits, the youth delegates start the process, not only are the relationships with government built, already instituted with the G7, but also with the respective other lobbying groups, such that if there are shared priorities between the Youth 7 and the Women's 7, they can co-lobby and ensure that the policies that they share can go into the broader communique. But it's not an easy journey, and the delegates certainly have their work cut out for them.
Well, thank you, Jordan. I'd like to take the opportunity of that conference to share a few memories to my international fellows that relates to what I just said from a French perspective. Let me share my screen. That's, oh, well, the team deactivated my capacity to share my screen, so I'm sure they'll give me the right to do it. But in the meanwhile, I'll keep going with the questions to Alberta. Alberta, you've been extensively lobbying for youth voice on the international stage, not only at the G20, G7, but also at the World Economic Forum. Could you also let us know how you assess the G20 capacity to listen to what youth says, to the G7 capacity to integrate advocacy from our groups, and how do you make sure from the Italian perspective that you are in charge of, that we keep being listened to?
Of course. So I want to point out one thing. One thing that I realized in 10 years is that this process, the Y7, Y20, and G7, G20, are very, very important process. You know, you have like a lot of young people, events, simulation, and you have like tons of conferences every year that like involve young people. But what I really realized is that this particular summit has really the power to make a difference, because it's directly part of like a very important process that is the G7, G20. And I think that it's very important always remember that, just like, you know, to understand that we have like, it's very important for us to make sure that we take this opportunity and we put forward our ideas. So on our side, what will happen this year, it's very similar to what already Othman and Jordan described. We were very, very happy to see. So as you may know, this is the first year that Italy is hosting the G20. So Italy hosted the G7 a few years ago, but this is the first time in history that it's hosting the G20. And there is a lot of attention. The Italian institution, the Italian government are working very hard to make sure that the process will be a very good one, with a lot of challenges, because of course a lot of things will be online. But we were very happy to see that there was a lot of engagement and interest by the Italian institution toward the process. And Othman mentioned the role of the working group. we basically have a similar process, and we were contacted by different working groups related to the Italian ministries to make sure that we have time basically to have an intervention in their work and to put forward our ideas. Same things with the other engagement group. We work closely with the Women 20, with the Civil 20, the Business 20, to make sure that if we put forward voices from different perspectives, there is a bigger chance to be listened at the end. And I mean, this, you know, I think that this is a process, this kind of engagement with other engagement group and with other institutions, with the working groups, it's a process that came out year by year and is becoming stronger in the last years. And I think that is something very important to work on also for the future Y7 and Y20. So yeah, I mean, really the plan, it's very similar to what Othman and Jordan said for the summit. We will very push forward to the working with the other engagement group, with the working group, and at the end with the Italian Sherpas to make sure that our voices, delegates' voices would be listened.
Sure. Well, friends, I'd like to show my screen there to witness of what you said with some pictures, because as we say in French, there is no love, there are only proof of love, and that's how we make history. Let's look at those pictures. So this is this. I hope you will see the picture. Do you see something? Yeah, this is the picture of the team that was the French organizing committee and delegates in 2011 when we got to the G20 summit in Cannes. And see those badges? Those badges were stating we were press. We were allowed to get to the summit as journalists, meaning just like anyone. That was the first year. And 10 years ago, I mean, 10 years after, at the G7 summit in Biarritz, that France chaired also, that was the huge difference. That was the meeting room at the Presidency of the Republic, with all G7 Sherpas right there on the right, listening to the French head of delegations, the youth head of delegations. See the difference? Being no one, being someone. That is 10 years of work of what we did with patience, with determination, and obviously with cooperation with our sister organizations across the globe, MISC Foundation in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Future Leaders Network in the UK, Young Ambassador Society in Italy, and so on. And from a year to another, that very committed young people and young leaders made it through to the top level, then we got listened to. And Othman made a strong point. We've been speaking extensively about other outreach groups of the G20 and G7, like the B20 for Business 20, the Labor 20 for labor unions, etc., the Think 20 for think tanks, etc. But there is not only those groups, there are also other satellites of the G20 summit or the G7 summit itself, which are ministerial meetings. And Othman did take a very interesting example when he spoke about youth and employment. He's been able to advocate for youth employment when he was the chair last year, because 10 years ago, we had the first meeting of G20 ministers for labor. This did not exist at the time. And see, that guy is now running for French presidency, Xavier Bertrand, you all know him. He was the Minister of Employment at the time, and he was chairing the first G20 ministerial meeting of Minister of Employment. And that was actually our main goal, was fighting for a ministerial discussion about employment. And we got that point. We were involved in the task force for employment of the G20, which was an innovation, a policy innovation stemming from the French presidency back in the years. And Alberta, you were attending the summit. You remember Gatien, he was the head of delegation of the French team, and Marie, my vice president, and myself. And we're just having a small chat in a university in France with the French Minister for Employment to make sure 6 months after the summit, right before the first ever G20 minister meeting for employment, that our propositions were involved in their discussion. And from a year to another, rolling presidencies and experience have made sure that in the G7, in the G20 formats, the jobs that chairs every year do is not only connected to the G20 top level, the head of state and government, but also their ministers, to make sure that it goes through to direct public policy decision makers. That's why I just wanted to show you a different stuff on my screen. I'm just getting back to the conversation because we had many questions about how does this materialize? This is only words in the heads, in the heads of our candidates, and they wanted some memories to be shown. If you also have memories and pictures to show, get them ready and we'll share our screen again. Othman, I'm sure you have dozens of pictures of last year, and Alberta as well. Let's take the pictures and we'll look at it together. We had another question from Charlene, which was very interesting, and that gets me to the next round of question. We are meant to advocate for youth and for global humanity as a whole, and not from national positions. We are not there to replicate government's position. This is challenging every year. And as you know, our candidates are recruited throughout a G20 simulation where we task them with different national positions, just as they would encounter getting to the summit. But now they will be free of that charge and able to put forward their own ideas. But Jordan, you've been delegate in China in 2016. Could you let us know how this difficulty to get out of our national box is somehow difficult to go through? And how did you experience that as a delegate? And I'll ask the same question to Othman, who also has been in charge of making sure of this this year. Jordan first.
Sorry, could you just clarify? That is to how to overcome sort of national bias, is it? In the process?
How to make sure that we are not framed by our national backgrounds.
That is an extremely challenging question, I think, and it is especially true in the Y20 processes, where you have such rich diversity of delegates, and priorities really are very diverse. I mean, I guess I'll tell one very brief story, and then follow up maybe with a semi-intelligent comment. And I distinctly recall being, I was on the sustainability track. One of the core areas we were focusing on, at least in my mind, when I was preparing for the summit, was climate change. That was universally the most important sustainability issue in the world. There was no dispute. Get to the summit expecting 20 countries, 20 delegates across the world to be united in this very simple setup. The truth was that was not the case at all. The priorities of the Japanese delegates were entirely skewed and focused far more on disaster risk reduction. I mean, you may remember not all that long ago, they had the Fukushima accident with the nuclear power plant. And their focus with sustainability was entirely skewed towards that lens. I distinctly recall the South Korean delegates focusing far more on environmental sustainability and landscapes, because they were having issues with dust particles in cities due to landscape destruction. I could go on. Each respective nation had a very different lens. And so I went into the process expecting a very simple, straightforward negotiation where we can come together and all agree that climate change is the worst situation that the world's ever seen, and that we can put together a compelling piece for why we should be prioritizing this at the international level. The main lesson that came away from that is twofold. One, do not underestimate how diverse the opinions, backgrounds, and experiences other delegates bring to the table. I think underestimating that will put you on the back foot the moment you start negotiating. I think the secondary to be aware of course, you are there in many ways to represent your own national position. And I think I saw a comment in the chat earlier around how do you ensure that you truly are representative at a national level, and you need to speak to young people, and not just young people who are very easy to engage with, the full spectrum, people who are difficult to get hold of, maybe not digitally aware, maybe sort of socially excluded, young offenders and so on, like fully grasp the position of your national view, so that when you're in those rooms and you're trying to negotiate on behalf of your policy proposals that you spent a long time putting together, there's justification and there's bridges to be built when speaking to other delegations. But I think 100%, it's extremely challenging to remove those lenses, and it's actually even more frustrating when you're seeing other delegates with that lens. And I think there's a degree of compassion required and a degree of preparation.
Thank you very much, Jordan, for that reminder of being representing but not representative of your country. And that's very difficult balance to strike. Othman has been working extensively on this specific issue, as well as the chair, running global consultations to prepare the last Y20 summit. Othman, could you let us know, how did you stroke that balance between being leaders and recognized leader of youth, but not being leaders representing different national positions, just like a very weaker copycat of the G20 itself?
Good question. And definitely that's, as Jordan has mentioned, it requires a delicate balance. The first thing that we need to keep in mind, and I think every single delegate of the Y20 need to keep in mind, is that 50% of the world's population approximately is younger than the age of 30. And about 90% of them live in developing countries. The people living in developing countries suffer from multiple more than people, or the 10% that live in developed countries, specifically around education, employment, health, and so on. Of course, when we say young now, that's a very difficult thing to be. It's very difficult to be young, especially now during COVID-19. And I would argue that it was always the case, specifically after the 2008 financial crisis. But that's exactly what the G20 is hoping to alleviate, is to make the world, hopefully, a better place. But in order to do that, you have to have two different points of view. There are some specific challenges or perhaps topics that your country, for example, does not stand for or does not agree to. But that should not be the only thing that you keep in mind. You should also keep an open mind into working with others on making sure that policies at the end of the day create an impact. Because you're not there, unfortunately, for many people think that they're there just to develop a communique. A communique is just a document, it's just a piece of paper. Your main goal there is to come in and actually create a difference. And the difference has to be through the G20 process. And the G20 process stipulates that that difference is through policy making. So you need to be creative into making sure that the policies that you suggest are not only in line with the G20 field, but also in line with helping and supporting young people. And that delicate balance changes every year due to the different priority areas that the countries or the G20 focuses on, different priority areas that the Y20 focuses on, and also upon the people that work there. But overall, the direction of G20 processes was usually on the risk-averse side. The direction of the Y20 policies are very much on the revolution or innovation side. And that requires a lot of thinking and working with the other delegates in order to make sure that these policies play into account. Now, what we've done across the Y20 process is to actually take a very different approach from having or being quite involved into the discussions. So what we've done is essentially had the delegates come together. They meet on 3 meetings or official meetings. And then afterwards, they met before the summit, since it was online, and had discussions prior to the summit itself. We've had, of course, challenges on our own. In many cases, these challenges were quite big to the point that it actually risked the process. But at the end of the day, we were able to enforce the policies and we'd had the final communique.
Well, that was indeed a very specific year in which, for the first time, we had a delegation trying to remove its commitment from the group. That never happened before, and that is also a very strong sign on what is happening on the global stage in general. We as French were very sensitive to that situation, because it was the Turkish delegation not wanting to sign up with the rest of the group about enforcing further and bolder the Paris Climate Agreement. So we've been fighting on your side. But that was a very unique moment that already happened at the G20 level in 2018 during the G20 summit under the presidency of Argentina, where the clauses about free trade were for the first time off the table for some countries, but that never happened before 2020 for youth groups. I'd like to keep going on with this question of impact that has been raised by many different candidates listening to us and looking forward to know what were the major successes of the G20, the Y20 and Y7. We got questions about that from Alexia, Cynthia. I'd like to turn back to Alberta again to know, in the course of this journey you've been through, what were the main recommendations that Italian delegates have been able to pass to G20, G7 leaders, especially in your country? How did it materialize that you got heard? What did it change in policy framework at the national or global level from your perspective?
Yes, thank you very much. I think that in the past years, there has been impact mainly on two particular themes. The first one being climate and the second one being education. As you may know, Italy, as government, as nation, is very keen to renewable energy, and in general, it puts a lot of attention on the climate issues. And for this reason, in the last years, one of the topics that had main impact in terms of then the G20 Italian position has been the position that the delegates pass regarding to climate. So the government was very, very open and very, very interested in listening what young people were thinking about the climate. In every single meeting, so with Italian delegates, basically before and after the summit, we have meetings with the Italian Minister of Foreign Affairs and other ministries in which the Italian delegates meet representative of the institution to present the proposal, even if when the G7, G20 is not in Italy. And the climate was one of the biggest things. And some of the proposals were actually introduced in the Italian position for the G20. So I'm not speaking about the G20 final communique, but I'm speaking about the documents that Italy presents as government and put forward to the G20. So climate was one of the themes. The other one was education. And of course, it's another big topic, very important for young people. And a few years ago, there was a proposal from the Italian delegates regarding education. The government was very happy about that, and I remember that they took it, and again, it was passed on the Italian president, on the Italian documents that was passed to the G20. So on our side, what was very interesting to see is that Italian institutions were very open to listen, and they actually put some recommendation and put it in the official Italian position for the G20.
Yeah, and in Alberta, could you you've been referring to the specific Italian example of integration of youth proposals to their national position on climate, which is one of the most important topic in the eyes of our applicants to this year delegation. Could you let us know what type of recommendation went through? I mean, we always look forward to very actionable ideas that are able to be embedded in the national or in the global position of the G20 leaders. What did make it through?
So there were different recommendations, to be honest, that were put forward in the different years. I should take the communique of the last years and just have a look at that. So I can let you know more precisely which proposal, but in general, so basically in Italy, it's made by a lot of small companies, family companies. This is very peculiar of the Italian economic system. Instead of having massive companies, there are a lot of small companies, and there are a lot of small companies that started to do a lot of innovation regarding the climate, so to produce renewable energy and to produce other tools and services that are very important to fight climate change. So one of the things was basically, if I remember well, to take the Italian model and give a tax incentive and more in general incentive to make sure that also the small companies have the resources to develop tools to fight the climate change.
All right. And Jordan, in the past years, since you've been a delegate in Beijing, are there any specific recommendations in the UK that you've been able to pass?
Yes. So, okay, there's maybe two things to say here about passing things into the communique. I think, first of all, and Othman I know can speak to this with greater clarity than I can, but it's pretty rare to see word for word text to transfer from the Y20 or Y7 communique directly into the G7, G20 communique. What is more reasonable or realistic is the core themes, or the very core specific proposal put together will find its way embedded within broader clauses. I think in the UK perspective, we obviously the host nation will have core priority over what goes in, and they'll be hosting that process and managing that relationship between the youth working group and the G7 or G20. But when delegates come back, we do a lot of work directly with our government counterparts to see how well we can align what came out of the Y7 process or Y20 process that didn't necessarily or partially made it through to the communique at the G7 or G20 level and influence at a wider level. Now, tangibly, it's very difficult to say what that means to at a government level. Those who follow UK politics will know we had a pretty turbulent last 5 years and a lot of changing government priorities. But we also embed crucial as part of our delegate program is that after the summit, the young delegates are expected to either on their own or various combinations of them to actually go about and enact some real change in the communities that they live in. And actually be that voice of change and that power unit rather than sort of offset that responsibility to government. And that's an important part of the process because they think about that really from day one of selection right the way through at summit and then afterwards. And there's been a range of different outcomes that we can measure and tangibly look at. We publish an impact report every year to try and measure that tangibly, accumulate that, and sort of provide that as a feedback to next year's delegations. But it's a combination of all above. And I think, as I mentioned a few times now, really the most important thing I think that comes out of the summit is feeding back into young people what the output of this is. Trust in democracy is the lowest it's ever been among young people in the history of the process. And I think part of the driving factor is just feeling disengaged from political processes and especially disengaged from international political processes. And so by feeding that back into young people and showing them that their voices through these youth summits has real tangible power, I think goes some way to building a more equitable society that young people can thrive in.
Thank you so much for this this humble answer, I'd say. I'd just like to take this opportunity to highlight that the role of the Y20 and of Y7 is more the role of an agenda setting group, making sure that the priorities of young people are heard, taken into account, and are driving the agenda of the G20 or the G7, and that it's more the role of an agenda setter than a think tank or a sparring partner that makes sure that line by line the text of the G20 or the G7 is reflecting a youth-led agenda. That would be a way that would be way too much over-promising and under-delivering way of spinning the G20 youth group or the G7 youth groups. It's also a way to gain momentum at the G20 level or the G7 level on what is at stake for young people. And look back at what we had in 2019 in the Paris G7 Youth Summit, the Y7. We advocated for declaring climate emergency at the global stage. And of course, we were not the only one group on Earth thinking of this very important need, but we were part of a bigger movement for climate emergency. That materialized, but we could not take ownership of this result as a major success of our advocacy work. Well, that takes me back to the whole story. Again, I'd just like to double check with you three if you have collected pictures, if you want to show some of them, because we are able to share our screens. So did any one of you find picture? Othman, you'd like to get first? You could take us throughout some memories of the Saudi Y20 summit. You can share your screen. You take the lead of the conversation.
So, so this is actually the Y20 Inception, and this was also the last meeting where the Y20 had a gathering, a physical gathering. And this was at a time when international travel has literally just stopped. And it was also the last inception of an engagement group that was held physically. So this is actually at the MISC grounds. And the top two photos here. And this was at the start of the agenda setting. The person who you see presenting on the right-hand side here, this is actually the Saudi Sherpa. So we involved the Saudi Sherpa at the start of the process. And we actually, I believe this level of engagement was one of the key reasons where we actually were invited to present the priorities of the Y20 during the third Sherpa meeting to all of the Sherpas of the countries. At the bottom, 4 pictures here, this is the youth boot camp that we held in January of 2020, which feels like a millennia ago now. And here was basically us holding meetings with youth to talk about the priorities that we've selected and what are the main issues there. We also had a lot of people coming in online too to discuss. So we had a room for each of the priority areas that we had. What you see here is actually a cool initiative that we've had, because when we said, so one of the funny things about Y20, it's actually the Twitter handle of a Saudi soccer player or football player. And if you go on Twitter, you'll find him. His name is Yasser with a Y. And so we decided, you know what? Why don't we just do a campaign that actually goes into football, where a lot of young people in Saudi, which is basically 70% of the world, the Saudi population is young. And we actually engage them on the Y20, tell them what it is, because not a lot of people knew. And that was actually one of the main goals that we had within our Y20 presidency, was to involve young people. And so we showcased the Y20 right before COVID-19 hit and everything closed for a couple of months here in Saudi. So this is a few pictures from memory lane, so to speak.
Thank you so much, Othman, for get us to view these pictures. I was not even aware of the fact that you had a football match just for you. That was so funny. I remember the thing on Twitter, but I did not see the football thing. Jordan, do you have some pictures? You were a delegate in China. You've been also involved in different other groups. Like to share some pictures with us?
I have one photo I'd like to share. So this is the final head delegate meeting at the 2016 Y20 summit in China. This particular meeting was in Shanghai. And the reason I'm showing you this photo is really come back to a discussion we were having earlier around the role of young people and the importance of engaging with your counterparts internationally, but with young people in your respective countries. This meeting took place, I think it's 7 p.m. local time, and there was a special dinner prepared for 9 p.m. You can see the photographers around, people taking photos, everyone looks pretty alert. Well, this meeting went on until about 4:30 the following morning. This extended on far beyond, I think they had 2 recesses, far beyond the expected time, and really was only finally signed half an hour before the opening ceremony the next day. The reason being was that across the Y20 process, and I'm sure I see Othman smiling, I'm sure he resonates with this experience richly in vivid near memory. But the key thing I want to illuminate here really is that the key lesson was young people globally are not one uniform group of people who share the same set of priorities. That was the mistake I went into this process with, because young people around me in the UK, certainly, we have a very shared set of view. And so a lot of what you see in the media may even lead you to believe that young people share the same priorities globally, but it just is not the case. And the second piece here is around, how do you square the 2 circles? How do you come together as one group advocating for change at the G7 and G20 level, whilst also representing the young people from your home country in a meaningful way? It's a very difficult challenge, and one that ultimately comes from preparation. But I think this is a fantastic photo that reminds me of that key challenge of individual participants trying to protect their national interests, whilst also trying to appear as a unified body to the G7 and G20.
Absolutely.
So I hope that was nice.
Indeed. Thank you so much for this very funny and insightful memories from what you've been through as delegates. I'd like to also show you some pictures that I brought from my 10-year journey, just as Alberta has. I'm trying to find a picture of Alberta 10 years ago, which would be funny, but I found other other pictures that I like to show you. And right after that, Alberta, you'll be able to showcase. So this is it. No, not this one. Look, this guy on the left, it's Président Giscard d'Estaing. He was the founder of the G7 in 1975. And a few years ago, he was opening the recruitment forum in France. And he was about to turn 84 at the moment, very living and vivid. And it was funny to see him confronting a huge assembly of 500 candidates applying to take his position. He was fighting very hard. But see, in France, we usually say that the new Giscard d'Estaing, so the new president, is Macron. They do have the same government style. And that is a unique moment, I must remember, when right before the G7 summit in Biarritz, late August in 2019, all engagement group leaders were brought together at the presidency to present their own ideas. And I was very humbled to deliver the message of the 40 delegates that were brought in Paris to fight for a fair future. That is something we've been through, and it's not only. There was a question from Hugo about what happens after the Y20, Y7 stuff, and see what we usually do in France, and that is very demanding too, is that we keep engaging with parliamentary leaders, with international organizations, with all relevant stakeholders, as Othman pointed out. This is at the Constitutional Court in France, with the fellow delegates from the G7, U7 environmental group. And we were speaking to Laurent Fabius. He's the former prime minister, he's now the president of the Constitutional Court in France, which undertakes a very important reform of the constitution to embed in the ground law environmental protection, which was one of the main recommendations we took away from the Y7 summit in 2019, to get environment and climate change emergency into constitutions. And that's why we were going to the Supreme Court of French government. He also was before that the COP21 chair when the Paris Agreement were stricken. So he was one of the key opinion leaders and decision maker to convince, just as you've been laying out. I'm done with my pictures. I would have dozens of others, tons of pictures and memories to share with you, but I'd like Alberta to share our video and let us know how the memories from Italian perspective are. Alberta, you can share your screen if you want.
Okay, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Alberta, for showing these vivid memories. I'm 100% sure that this gave very much desire to the group to get to Milano next year, this year, I mean, and to London also. Well, it gets me to the last question I wanted to tackle with you guys. Those are beautiful memories. Those are amazing experiences that we've been showcasing to the candidates we have. But we are in times of crisis where our generation is very much affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'd like to know, what would you like to achieve as Y7, Y20 leaders this year to make sure that our generation is taken into account in dealing with the crisis? I'd like to go in that row. Maybe Othman first, to take away what the Y20 in Saudi Arabia did already on that sense in 2020. Then maybe Alberta, and last Jordan in this order. Othman, could you go first?
Sure thing. And before I start answering that question, Alberta, I'm coming to Milan, whether they block the travel or not. I'll swim there now after watching that video. The COVID-19 pandemic is a problem for everyone. The focus on the health effects have been mainly on the older generation. However, young people are amongst the most vulnerable from an economic sense, because they'll be dealing with the COVID-19 repercussions and consequences for years to come from an income perspective, and paying for that. In addition to this, COVID-19 has essentially stopped education almost entirely in some countries for periods of time, prolonged periods of time. Many people are calling the new generation COVID-19. And I think according to the OECD paper on youth, it was around 1.5 billion young people had their education affected. Unemployment rates for young people have been skyrocketed because we are among the most vulnerable generation when it comes to this. And also because we occupy the most informal types of jobs as young people, with very low social protection and no formal contracts or legal framework to protect us. And so these challenges are, I think, among the most obvious challenges, and these were the ones that we have pushed to the G20 in 2020. But I think what the negative effects of COVID-19, especially for young people, we released a statement, the COVID-19 statement of Y20 in 2020, where we divided it essentially into short-term, medium-term, and long-term effects. What I would like, honestly, for the G20 to focus on is on what many people have calling it now the secret pandemic, which is mental health. Mental health for young people has been quite a big issue. I would love to see a more firm response on the G20 from that. We did try to include it into the Y20 communique this year. We would love to see a way for us to push it, perhaps to the health working group. And maybe this is something that we can push on to within the G7 and the G20 this year. But definitely COVID-19 has been or will change, I think, many people's lives, and especially young people to come. But definitely, I would say for 2021, mental health should be a big health issue to focus on for sure.
Well, thank you so much, Othman, for this plea for mental health. That is an issue that is indeed increasingly important to us. It relates back to what we passed as the Y7 summit in 2019. The UK delegation was also very insisting on that specific issue. But before getting to the UK, I'd like to go to Italy and have Alberta's insights on what we should claim for as Y20 leaders this year.
Of course. I must say I'm very, very happy about the priorities of the Y20 this year. Also because these priorities are the results of a big consultation that we did last year. So we basically have like this online consultation, and we collected the voices of 10,000 young people. And basically we asked, what do you think the G20 priorities should be? We did this in collaboration with the Italian Minister of Foreign Affairs. And this was before that the G20 Italian presidency started. The first priorities, this was like huge. It was climate change, and there was like a huge agreement about that. You know, if you see the graphic, it's like climate change. It's just like everyone voted for that. And one of the topics of the Y20 is climate change. And as I said before, the Italian government is very, very keen to put forward proposal and to underline the importance of the climate change. So this should be one of the main focus. And what I remember that a couple of years ago, when I went with the Italian delegates to one of the meetings with the Italian Minister of Foreign Affairs, they said, you know, we see young people in the square, we see young people raising voices about climate change. This is the time for young generation to make young voices heard about climate change, and we are willing to listen. So I'm sure that the Italian government is very, very open and keen to listen young people's voices for climate change. So I think that this should be like really one of the big topic and focus. One other topic that I'm very, very happy about is inclusion. And this is particularly important with the impact of the COVID-19, because what we make sure is that we rebuild an economy and a world in which no one is left behind. And this is like, I think that this should be like really key for young people. So I would like to underline the fact that inclusion should be like also one of the things that the next delegates will keep in mind. And like, I'm really waiting for them to push forward recommendation for how to make this work better and more inclusive for everyone.
Thank you so much, Alberta. Jordan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I think for me, the number one overriding priority this year is to maximize the engagement we can have with young people globally. I think that the COVID pandemic of the last year has and will most affect young people. I've been following some of the chat. I see Enzo, I know you're unable to speak directly in the chat, but you correctly point out that all generations are affected by COVID. But the truth is, no cohort of people globally are more affected than young people. From a health perspective, of course, no. But from the long-term effect of education being disrupted at the systemic level at which it does, when we think about the employment damage that has been done to young people's prospects systemically and disproportionately over the last year, and the projections show that is to continue. When we think about the acceleration of digital and technology advances and what that means for engagement and preparedness for the future of work. And then finally, we think about what it means to progress as young people, developing and learning, the isolation, the social exclusion that has come with that has disproportionately affected growth and prospects for young people in the workplace and, of course, in education. And then, of course, we think of the environmental component. That's a big theme for the UK this year, not just being host of the G7, but also COP26, co-hosting with Italy in Glasgow, but it will most likely be partially virtual. The long-term impact of climate change will invariably affect the younger generations most. And the reason I care so much about engagement is because when you have a group systemically affected by issues and excluded by society at large, you are at significant risk of social discord. I often think back to a story when I was in school. My history teacher would so frequently call students idiots when they were not paying attention. And it was a little rude. We thought, why does he insist on using this word so liberally? And one day he's like, do you know, Jordan, what the origin of the word idiot is? It's like, no, maybe that makes me an idiot. He goes, no, Jordan, the origin of the word idiot comes from the Latin idiota, which means those who do not engage in civil discourse. And that has always stuck with me, that line, because when you think back to what it really means to engage, it means to be aware of what's going on around. We need to participate and, of course, be included. And the biggest mistake that we can make this year, when in a year and in a period where young people are so disproportionately affected by the global changes that we see uniformly, is we risk excluding them from the conversation. So when I think about what Y7 2021, we don't just want a phenomenal year for delegates. We don't just want to ensure the policies are pushed through to the G7 level. We want to maximize the engagement and feedback that young people globally receive and engage with, so that long term they can participate in society and minimize risk of perhaps being called an idiot. That's all from me.
Thank you so much, Jordan. I guess that is almost a wrap. We are getting to the end of this conversation, but I'd like to do something I said I would not do again, but I'd like to share some pictures again, because it's the way I like to conclude this conversation, and in showcasing what is at stake when we are doing this exercise, to make sure that our fellow candidates do get it correctly. So remember, and this is something that could happen next year, this is the painted hall of Greenwich University in UK that we were hosted for the gala dinner closing the Y8 summit chaired by the UK in 2013. Well, I just wanted to show you this picture for many reasons. First is that diplomacy is, and we are French, so pardon my French, but it's always about dining together or having a lunch together. And I just wanted to make sure that our fellow delegates have the sense that diplomacy is not only about doing business, it's not only about passing policy, it's also about creating bonds. And I wanted to highlight this because in this period of COVID-19, where everything gets digital, we sometimes forget that. I do hope that next year in Milano or in London, we will have a very powerful moment of community building. And this is why it is so long-lasting for Alberta, and I'm sure, because we've been getting friends from a year to another to sustain our efforts. I just also wanted to show this picture because this venue was very, very meaningful, at the heart of academic research for years and centuries, but it was also too rich to be shown. And I want our candidates to know that being in such a venue is not making you someone. It's because you're someone that you get to such a venue. And when you get a delegate, when you have the chance to represent your country and to speak on behalf of youth, the purpose is not to get there. It's to be relevant in that room, to be right in that room, to be able to speak in that room and to pass your ideas in that room, and not vice versa. The second picture I wanted to show to our applicants and share to my fellow Y20, Y7 chairs is this one. See, this is the G20 summit in 2011. It was in Deauville. And if you look at that guy, the picture is not so well, but this is Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook. And this is a moment when the G8 tried to get platforms and the digital economy involved in making and designing public policy, in making sure that the digital revolution is playing a positive role in the change we hope for the ecological transition, for equality between men and women, in fighting speech of hate online, etc., etc. That actually failed. It did not only fail because of lack of leadership, of leaders that tried to engage with digital platforms themselves, but because of discontinuity from a year to another of the ambition we had at the time. I'm not 100% sure that Boris Johnson or Giuseppe Conte will aim at convening digital leaders at the table when the G20 or the G7 meets next year. But look, even this year, when we were in the midst of a pandemic, the G7 did not meet. the G7 itself, because of lack of leadership, because the lack of stewardship, because of the lack of political ambition. And we are actually in a year where it's not only about dealing with the crisis, it's about having a common idea of international leadership itself, making sure that we are on the right track. And we come out of an age where we were getting in the wrong direction. The third picture I wanted to show you, and that's a good memory for Alberta, who is around the table somewhere right there, actually. This is a gathering of all European delegates that we had in Brussels in April 2011, meeting with the G20, G7, G8 Sherpa of the President of the European Commission on the left, to discuss at the European level what we wanted to achieve within the Y20, Y7 format. Around this table, there are many young people who were just crafting the ideas to make sure that 3 months later we would be able to pass insightful and actionable recommendations. But I'd like to take this picture to highlight the fact that first, being a delegate to the Y20 and Y7 summit is very demanding. It needs a lot of research. It needs a lot of background information. And this is also important to know that it needs to be ready. It needs to be up to speed, to have an impact on the G20, G7 leaders. You need to be able to connect with them all the year through. That reminds us of what Othman told us in the introduction and the pictures he shown. It's a yearly process with many different meetings. And the other idea I wanted to showcase with this picture is that coalition building at a global stage, and obviously specifically in the EU, is also very important. And that we as Open Diplomacy have been kept dedicated to making sure that the French position is advocated for as a European position. I just wanted to say to Jordan that despite the UK leave out of the European Union, we can keep going through this path, because as you've said, it's not only about Europe, it's about values themselves. And the UK is also using its international leadership as the G7 chair this year to launch something new, maybe D20, about democracy 10, with South Africa, with South Korea, with India, with Australia. Make sure that we keep advocating for what we think is right to keep going for human rights. And the last picture I wanted to showcase is this one. This is during the Y20 summit in 2011. And you will see someone on that picture that is in this conference. She was in the economic group. She's right there. And this is, see, this picture is so funny because it seems like it was taken in a century year ago. But it's actually a meaningful memory of what was looking like this initiative 10 years ago. Only young people, students for the most of them, trying to craft a new path for young people to be heard at a global stage with very few means. Alberta had to pay herself to attend to that event. We were only bringing people together with their own money, meaning that at the time, and it has changed a lot under the stewardship and leadership of Y20 chairs like Othman, like Jordan, like Alberta, we've been crafting something bold that enables youth to be at the table without paying for themselves. Now it's governments securing the money to get there. It's also national organizations like Open Diplomacy making sure we have means to get there. And that made a lot of change. And it's thanks to Alberta's leadership and many others who paid to make it happen 10 years ago. Not too much money, but it was still something to make sure that this is something that happens for real 10 years after. So I'm done with pictures, I'm done with memories, I'm done with speaking so much. I just wanted to thank Othman, Jordan, Alberta for being with us this afternoon. It's the first time, and I'm sure not the last, we do such a gathering to to make sure that our applicants are so motivated to get there. We look forward to the next steps. I mean, actually tonight we will decide on who is on the shortlist of the delegates getting to Milano, getting to London. I know next week Jordan already appointed scheduled a meeting with the G7 Sherpa in the UK. So it's going to be very fast from there. And it's because of a very long-lasting commitment of yours that is very demanding. And I wanted to pay tribute in this conference to your volunteer job to make sure that young people from all across the G20 and G7 nations, including those who are not delegates, but more in general, people of less than 30 are able to speak up. That's because of you, that thank you, and I wanted to highlight that. Thank you so much, Alberta, Jordan, and Othman, and we will close that conference from here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I look forward to meeting the new delegates.